Okay, so let's get started. I'm so happy on this Saturday afternoon to bring you our immune series topic called The Critical Role of Hormone Optimization for Your Immune System. During this time, when many of us over the last 4 months have been restoring, reflecting, and resetting, we realize that we're making new choices, dreaming new images, and creating new ways to live and heal the earth fully. And as we do this, we're actually turning on what I call basic self-healing mechanisms. And when we address the basic causes of suboptimal immune function, then we automatically are also handling the downstream causes like H. pylori or EBV or Lyme glyphosates. And the fact is that this is what we often address in a traditional approach. So as we are resting and restoring and correcting our adrenal glands and our immune systems, we're actually correcting downstream factors, which is great. Some of the specifics that I'm going to cover today are who's at risk for immune compromise. I'll be talking about the 5 basic areas that cause immune dysfunction, including, most importantly, the role of bioidentical hormones like thyroid, cortisol, melatonin, DHEA. I'll be touching on nutrients, stress, pH, water toxins, chronic infections, EMF reduction, and oxygen. The highlight is going to be about the hormones. It's really important for us to understand how the chronic stress response actually disturbs the gastric mucosa, disturbs immunity, water structure that surrounds all our DNA, and actually eventually causes depletion of the adrenal thyroid pathway and nutrients, what I call the fuel tank. The regenerative approach, which I'm going to talk about, to turn on innate self-healing and the immune system through the 5-point model system, actually approximates regeneration just like the long living. The last thing I'm going to cover, most importantly at the end, is exactly what you need to do to optimize the hormones. And it does turn out that there are some new things that have shown up after seeing who's actually at risk for having serious complications from any infection, especially COVID-19, which we're all dealing with today. The premise of the program has to lie on the fact that every person is born with the ability to turn on innate self-healing and even the gift of healing others. So the aim has to be to empower you to be in the driver's seat for your own health. And when I say you, I know I'm speaking to many doctors and many health care practitioners. So I want you to view this talk as being aimed at you, because we always have to start with ourselves first so that we can do the best for those we take care of. For those who don't know me, I got my medical degree at the University of Maryland. I did my residency at Georgetown. I'm board certified by the American Board of OBGYN and have an appendix certification by the American Board of Integrative Medicine, which is new. And then I spent many years, for those who don't know, in the nonprofit world with the Safe Motherhood Project to reduce maternal mortality. Actually, one of the places where I learned so much about natural mechanisms of healing, and that ended up being an inspiration for me to pursue the path I've pursued. And then finally, I spent 5 years as a research intern at the National Cancer Institute's Laboratory of Immunology. How appropriate. In 2003, I realized that pharmacy and surgery did not cure people, as it does not address the causes. So I shifted my focus to empowering people to be in the driver's seat for their own health by addressing the causes through the 5-point model system. And this actually turns on innate self-healing and reverses over 85% of all symptoms and disease. The center where we tested these out was Sejun Institute, where we are joined with a full team of various specialties. And I am so happy and thankful and grateful for this team, because without this team, none of these results would have happened, which are over the 16 years in over 12,000 patients and in over 100 doctors' offices who we've trained. These simple regenerative protocols have actually been drilled down to use the least number of steps and capsules for over 85% effectiveness. And this is really important because people can follow simple things. When it starts to get complicated, it becomes something which becomes a chore. And you certainly don't want your wellness program to simultaneously be your stressful program. Using the system, the 5-point model system, in a particular order, we've had over 85% resolution in over 12,000 patients of all of the conditions you see here. And mostly we aim for correcting energy, sleep, gut issues, weight gain, anxiety, depression, and pain. And it turns out that as you correct those, everything on the right side of the page simultaneously gets corrected and reversed. And 90% of people end up discontinuing the top medications that people are on these days, including pain meds and sleep meds and reflux meds and antipsychotics and anti-cholesterol. I have a very important thing to tell you about what causes high cholesterol in this talk. And it turns out over the years, from 15 years ago, and many of you may have noticed this, that very few men and very few people under the age of 35 and very few healthcare practitioners actually pursued our services. But as of last year, we're at 30% men, 35% under the age of 35. Young people are really getting ill. A broad range of people, actually extending to infants and children, and greater than 20% being healthcare providers, and that is growing. And you can expect to see this growing because most of us realize that the best way to stay healthy is to use our own doctor, which is ourselves. So to turn on innate self-healing. Our specific immune programs have been used successfully since 2010. If any of you have not seen them, they're actually on icrmlearn.org, where we cover full science and step-by-step for those protocols. And the reason why this has been at the forefront for us is because immune failure has been on the rise for decades. People who are getting sick more than ever before. I cannot get rid of my chronic EBV. I have multiple doctors treating me for Lyme's. This is the things that you are most definitely hearing. My H. pylori is incessant. Can I get rid of HPV? I have SIBO and autoimmunity. And then, of course, the latest, which is COVID complications, COVID pneumonia, and COVID coagulopathy. And that's what makes this so important to address today, because COVID does not produce antibodies that stay in the body, which means we're going to be dealing with this for quite some time. When we look at who's immune compromised, is it really those people that I just mentioned? Or is it almost everybody in this day and age? People who report cold hands and have thyroid deficiency, or dry eyes, or fatigue, headaches, patchy hair loss, repeated infections, unexplained weight gain. Any of these things is actually associated with a compromised immune system, because it's compromised at the level of the very basic areas, which are 5 areas. And when we look at the opportunity that we've gotten from this COVID, we have to remember that it's a thank you, because if it wasn't for that cold hands or the headaches, or if it wasn't for repeated infections or needing to optimize our immunity, we might never really have the opportunity to optimize our health. So I learned this from Dr. Marshall, and I always say this: no matter what happens, say thank you, because at the end of the day, you're going to learn something and evolve to the next level. And so these times, of course, are a time that reminding us about the fact that we have to optimize our immune system. And we can assume that most people will eventually be exposed to this virus. And it turns out that antibodies do not sustain us in this fight. So they're starting to have quite a bit of literature coming out showing that antibodies are very short-lived. So what's the answer? The answer is to rebuild and maintain optimal immunity and then move forward without fear. Because, you know, when we talk about all these things like flattening the curve, or we talk about protecting ourselves with masks and such, and decreasing the rate at which we get infected, we have to also count in that everybody eventually will get exposed and be able to handle it with an optimal immune system, which has all of the organs that you see here. So it really is a whole bunch of organs, and 60% of it is in the Peyer's patches, which are in the gut, 60 to 70%. So what do we do to start optimizing our immune system? And most of you have heard of the 5-point model system, which forms the basic immune program. And we have reversed 85% of all conditions just using a program of optimizing the hormones, optimizing the nutrition, and optimizing means above the 75th percentile. Remember, if you get a thyroid lab and it's sitting in the normal range, that just means it's between the 10th and the 90th percentile. That doesn't mean it's functioning optimally in the above 75th percentile. Optimizing detoxification, physical stress, and then emotional and mental stress. So these 5 areas and underlying imbalances in these lead to all symptoms and disease, including immune weakness. And if we look at what the long living cultures are doing to actually correct these, it's real simple. It's God gave it to us. You get in the sun, naked if you can, ground your feet into the earth to reduce all the electromagnetic stresses that have collected on your body by being indoors and connected to Wi-Fi. I mean, just today, I'm going to suggest your prescription is go outside, get barefooted, naked if you can, and get your feet in the soil. That's how we were meant to be. And if you look on icrmlearn.org, you'll actually see quite a bit on correcting the bioenergetics. Drinking water, 100 ounces of pink salt and water and lemon, because it will raise your pH and allow all those 100,000 man-made toxins to disappear. Breathing deeply, oxygenation, and then, of course, the vibration of joy. So if we were with the sun, earth, water, joy, and oxygen, we would be regenerating like the long-living cultures. And what we're doing in modern society is realizing that the speed of the engine, which is all of the physical and the heart-mind stress, actually is determining the use of the fuel tank. And we have low fuel tanks right now. So the very first exercise that we normally do to balance hormones, because I remember when people would come in and say, oh, I want to balance my hormones. And it sounded like you measure the hormones and you give them a hormone. But at the end of the day, if you've got a system where you are running too fast, it doesn't matter how much fuel you put in the tank with hormones and nutrition, you're still going to be low. So there's 2 parts to reducing stressors. One is to reduce conscious stressors by simplifying life and doing a My Priorities exercise. Every time I do this exercise, I find myself completely shocked at how many things I've added to my life and how many things just aren't serving the higher purpose. So if any of you has the ability to just draw these circles on a paper and figure out what your priority is and spend your next 90 days on that, that would behoove you. But then come the unconscious stressors, and those have to do with the way we respond to stress. Because although we might not change how many hurricanes come our way, we can certainly change the way in which we respond. We could either be responding on the red curve, which is draining and impairs immunity, or we could be responding on the blue curve, which is coherent and has appreciation and love and care, which promotes immunity. And it turns out that you can flip this switch in 60 seconds. So it certainly does not take hours or 20, 30 minutes like mind-related meditation, because it turns out that what we found out is the heart actually controls the mind. And the heart produces the strongest electrical field and magnetic field in the body, which means it's programming your entire body. This is critical because over 70% of your nervous system lies in the gut. So these electromagnetic waves are transmitting to the gut. The gut has over 70% of your immune system in it, right? And therefore, when we are in a state of anxiety or worry or irritation, we are actually affecting our intestines and our immunity. 60 seconds later, on the blue line, we're able to get to a place where we are programming our intestines and we're also structuring our water. So not only are we correcting the immunity through our intestines, but there's a very different water structure with the top curve versus the bottom curve. And why is that important? It's important because the structure of water changes with our emotions, and the structure of water determines its function. There's lots and lots of studies showing this, including Gilbert Ling's study that actually they won the Nobel Prize for. And why is structure important? Because just to give you an example, take carbon. In one form, it's hard diamond. In one form, it's soft coal. It's all carbon, but the function is different based upon the structure. So when we have emotions in our heart, and this is a Chinese proverb, the water reflects it. And so does the effect of our thoughts. So our positive thoughts, have an effect on everything in the body. So what I'm telling you is the first way to correct the hormones is really to start to correct our emotions, the things we can correct, and to correct our thoughts. But it extends much beyond that, because it turns out that this electromagnetic field extends 12 to 15 feet from the body in every direction. And that was shown in squid magnetometers. It turns out that these cardiac electromagnetic fields actually serves as a communication system between people. So we affect others' health and immunity through this mechanism. And it can be either positive or negative. There's many Fortune 500 companies that actually use heart math and these systems to correct the field before meetings. And it leads to a 30 to 40% increase in productivity. So what I'm saying is that bubble of joy that we talked about structures the water within your body and also corrects your immune system. So the vibration of fear not only depresses your immune system, but it also depresses the immune system of others. So we're having a huge impact on people before we even open our mouth. We always kind of knew that the verbal communication is secondary to what's coming off of our heart, our vibration, if you will. And I show you this picture because when you do the exercise heart math, and you can see it on one of my other videos, I'm not going to go through it today, but basically what you're doing is you're creating a virtual reality by closing your eyes and breathing deeply and imagining yourself in all of the senses, feeling, smelling, seeing, hearing, of something that gives you joy. And it turns out that that virtual reality is the same. And I can tell you that this is one of the most powerful things that we do to correct the hormonal system. The next is body stress. And I mentioned that it has to do with how much oxygen is actually reaching every cell, because low oxygen states are associated with all chronic disease, immune compromise, cancer, viral lung invasion. We treat all of these people with oxygen that's concentrated at 100%. And we recommend that one of the ways to correct it is to belly breathe. And you can see breathing in your chest is very different from breathing. Take a breath. Breathe into your belly. That's the right way. And then, of course, there's those that exercise on with oxygen therapy, and that increases the oxygenation to the point where the effect on the body in 20 minutes is equal to 2.5 hours. So mind, body, and now detoxification, which I told you was about drinking water, because our modern living conditions are literally a perfect storm for immune failure. And even the National Cancer Institute says up to 90% of all cancers in the USA are caused by the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and other completely preventable environmental causations. And this is obviously really important because this is also what's causing immune failure. And these toxins include all kinds of things, which most of you are completely aware of, and I'll be talking about in another talk. But we need to screen this. And then that brings me to the Wi-Fi, which really affects our energy. And we know that we are energy beings, so everything is energy, and energy is everything. And we have to correct the impact of the man-made electromagnetic field. And your best way to correct it is to just go back to nature's magnetic field by getting outside, as we talked about. And if you want to see a webinar on how to correct EMF in the bioenergetic field for your immune system, go to icrmlearn.org, and that's exactly what you're going to see. The reason why we talk so much about water is because it is 70% of your body. Imagine your whole body's genes is surrounded by water. So the structure of that water matters. The toxins in that water matters. And that structure is controlled by the joy that you put out and put in to your body. This is my favorite drink. I'm actually drinking a version of it. And I call it Adrenal 8 because it's for the adrenal glands. Because of course you might know that when you have adrenal insufficiency, you simultaneously turn off the mechanisms that protect you from losing minerals and water. So this particular thing, we ask people to make 100 ounces and do pink salt. We get it from PRL, 92 minerals to taste. Pure water or coconut water. If you use coconut water, you don't have to use the minerals. Vitamin C or lemon, baking soda, and some ribose for those who are using this for energy. This is such a pick-me-up. And sometimes I even sprinkle AFA, blue-green algae, into it. And it is a serious power drink. So please realize that this is going to be the beginning of your hormones too. So I haven't gotten to talking about hormones yet, but I've told you to breathe, to be in a place of joy, to make sure that you're drinking enough fluids and avoiding the Wi-Fi. And the reason, of course, that we talk about this is because no disease can exist in an alkaline environment. So we actually recommend that people measure the pH in the morning. I've seen so many people taking hormones, nothing's working until the pH gets right and the water gets right. So greater than 6.7 is what you need for optimal cell function. And then, of course, the last organ of eliminating the toxins is the gut. And the gut has the microbiome and the bugs in it, and more than half your body is, of course, not human. And we have hundreds of studies at this point showing that probiotics regulate the immune system at the level of the gut. So it's not any question that we need to correct it. And this was actually a study published showing that there are specific types that are low in COVID patients and obviously predispose them. So protecting your microbiome is really important. And how do you protect it? One of the ways you protect it is to avoid genetically modified foods and to avoid Wi-Fi and EMF near your intestines as much as possible. Most of the probiotic species that are needed are the ones that correlate with your flora when you're born. And that, therefore, you can, of course, take it in supplement form, but more powerful is to take it in fermented food form. And I like to use this coconut milk yogurt or any kind of fermented foods because they're more bioavailable and have more active enzymes. So that brings us now to nutrition and then on to the hormones. So just quickly, Think about whether you have taken your shoes off and grounded your feet into the earth. The quality of our soil is dictating the diminution of nutrition. We know that we have a 50% decline right now in all nutrients. And it turns out that micronutrients have been proven by nature forever, because we wouldn't have them unless they were important. But now we have research and research and research. And I want to show you some of the important ones. Harvard says that zinc, vitamin C, and D are proven in immunity, and that they've known for a long time that this is linked to the severity of infection. Very critical. All of these vitamins and minerals are critical for immune response and antibody production. B, C, D, E, folic acid, zinc, copper, selenium. When we talk about what's necessary for the immune system, we have to realize that our nutritional knowledge is in its infancy right now. And being in its infancy, we don't really know everything that does everything. So you have to assume that every nutrient is important. And from this picture, you can gather that what I'm going to tell you is your most important source is going to be the food you eat and the bioavailability, because these nutrients are also vital to every stage of the immune response. So all types of immunity, all types of immune cells need all of the micronutrients you see down at the bottom. In fact, every immune cell function is affected by these things. And I used to always have some instinct that the recommended daily allowance was really just too low. And it turns out that this year it was actually published that you cannot get by with the RDA. You have to use numbers and amounts that are higher than the RDA. And that's their actual quote from their study. And for optimal protection, you need higher than the RDA, as we said. As an example, selenium will stop septic shock, but only at the upper levels. Similarly, vitamin D. We know that vitamin D is critical for immunity, but what if we discovered after everything this year that the higher vitamin D levels, the lower the risk of infection and the risk of complications? In fact, severe vitamin D deficiency has a 2-time likely major complication rate in COVID. Vitamin D increases antiviral activity in the bronchial cells. And supplementation protects against acute respiratory tract infection. So you're going to see, actually, people have started to pursue the possible increase in the levels after what we've seen with the COVID. It makes a huge difference. I like to use 5,000 to 10,000 units and keep the serum levels between 70 and 150. And you may know that vitamin D is critical to the thyroid, like the other things are. So the program should have real food, measure your nutritional status, let's talk about that, and some clean supplements. So the foods should always be organic and regenerative, and I'll be covering that in next month's nutrition and immunity lecture. But even the American Society for Nutrition is saying that food is at the top of everything that we use. And then we've got measurement, because one of the things that you can never know is all these studies are done without measuring anything. And I've been measuring with the SpectraCell test for over 15 years now. And it guides us because, for example, look at the stress pattern. B vitamins, magnesium, and vitamin C are always in people who have chronic stress. And so is low serine and low magnesium. So these are two areas that you want to definitely correct. As far as what you want to look for in a supplement, you definitely want to have vegetable capsule, no dyes, no preservatives, no magnesium stearate because it ruins your gut, no fillers. And there's certain minimum hormone activating doses like chromium. It really needs to be between 250 and 500 in the absence of measurement. Zinc, 25 to 50. And it turns out that these are the doses for immunity. Selenium, 200 to 400. Iodine, 500 to 1,000. B12, 1,000 to 2,000. tetrahydrofolate, 200 to 400, and active forms of all B vitamins. And when I've measured thousands of spectra cells over the years, what I found is that these are missing. And the only way to correct them is to use these kind of doses, which are quite a bit above the recommended daily allowance. You also want to use delayed release because people won't tolerate the gastric symptoms if they don't have a delayed release format. As far as hormones, I definitely have to mention magnesium because, as I said, although I never like to call out any specific nutrient as being more important than anything else, what I have found is magnesium alone at the right dose, and the right dose is always the dose that it takes to create diarrhea, and then one notch below that. But I have found it to single-handedly correct all of these things because it's so critical. It's the #1 deficiency we're finding across the United States is magnesium, and it's critical in ATP production. And it actually is critical at the neurological junctions because it's part of every single neurological reaction that occurs. And if you're deficient, it allows hyperactivity and anxiety. But also hyperactivity and anxiety create a deficiency. So in every single person that you see adrenal insufficiency and chronic stress, you're simultaneously going to find a magnesium deficiency. There's plenty of studies showing that magnesium blocks nerve excitation. I've even seen patients correct seizures with the right kind, which is the neurophilic type of magnesium. And it corrects the beta waves from being very active to being closer to alpha and theta. For hormonal optimization, it's the first thing I do. I always use an acetyltaurinate, what I call ATA magnesium, and I ask people to start taking them and going ahead and increasing every single day. And I want to make sure that on the other ingredient line, there is no magnesium stearate dyes or fillers. So that brings us to the hormones. And you can get a lot of hormones just by being in the sun. So when mind, body, and heart-mind stressors are high, the hormones and the nutrients are exhausted. And it always starts with adrenals first, then thyroid, and then the sex hormone. So a lot of people who say are having premature ovarian symptoms or having testosterone be low actually have low adrenal thyroid axis, and they're shunting a lot of hormones in that. If you come to the present day, in the situation of COVID, the Society for Endocrinology has said that patients with adrenal or pituitary insufficiency may be at higher risk. The American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists says the same thing, that they have increased rate of respiratory infection-related death. So if you look at what the recommendations are, and this is a professor at Georgetown where I did my residency, he really recommends 40 to 50 milligrams of bioidentical hydrocortisone for someone who's sick. It can have a huge impact on the course of the disease. And in the situation that I'm in, where I have so many patients with adrenal insufficiency, if they are above the age of 50 or they have very significant deficiency on the adrenal pathway, I'm just giving them 20 milligrams of bioidentical hydrocortisone, and it makes a very significant difference on the virus. I also suggest that you become familiar with bioactive silver because it works for all viruses. I found that myself, and this is, of course, something that I see that Dr. Hedaya talks about. And if you want to see that video, that's on icrmlearn.org. But this is, again, new data. It turns out that dexamethasone reduces mortality by 20 to 33% in people who are either in the ICU on ventilators or who are having oxygen therapy. Now, I can tell you that these very people who get symptoms from COVID or any infection actually have adrenal insufficiency. And the guidelines now have changed. They were really suggesting that people who have known adrenal insufficiency should have higher doses. The European Society came in very recently saying that the evidence shows that patients with SARS might have had underlying relative cortisol insufficiency, and both baseline and also caused by the stressors from the infection. I can tell you that in our practice, those patients who come in with immune complaints or any kind of significant complaint of recurrent infection, all the things we listed before, cancers, 100% of them have adrenal thyroid insufficiency. So it's not a question of if they have it, they do have it. So when we look at the main way of reducing the impact, we have talked about how to control the chronic stress response, because the chronic stress response creates a chain from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to release cortisol in times of stress, in times of an infection, a hurricane, a health problem, a car accident. And it turns out this is a very healthy response. You have an acute response where cortisol goes up and recovers, and that's in response to any kind of stressor. And then on the next stressor, it produces cortisol again. But if we're under this chronic stress response, we end up having a situation where our response isn't quite as vigorous. And for every stimulus, the nervous system fires and the cortisol system fires. And if it's depleted, it compromises the entire pathway. So whether or not it shunts it over, it compromises the entire pathway. So you'll see all the numbers being low. And it's very imperative that when you measure the numbers, you measure them before 8 a.m. because you're then going to get the peak for all of those numbers. And I'll have people coming in and say, well, what's my cortisol in the morning? Well, it turns out that the serum cortisol is not the best way to measure cortisol. But if you want to measure it, the cortisol, you have to do a 4-point salivary cortisol, which I've stopped doing because when I measure all these things in the serum in the morning, I get an idea of exactly what's going on, and it correlates with the salivary cortisol 100%. But just to remind you, the cortisol, the steroid hormone cascade is involved, and cholesterol is at the top, and it can either go towards a progesterone pathway or a DHEA pathway or a cortisol pathway, depending upon the needs of the body. And the number one cause of high cholesterol is most definitely chronic stress response. And I always suspected this because every single time we would correct the adrenal thyroid axis and correct some of the stressors and correct the way in which the response was taken emotionally, the cholesterol would come plummeting down. And then I see this study where Dr. Zugan did a wonderful study showing that the mean total cholesterol came down from 263 to 187. So in 100% of patients had over a 30% cholesterol drop with hormone restorative therapy, which includes, of course, the steroid hormones, but also the thyroid. And so that becomes a new way of dealing with cholesterol, and people don't end up needing Lipitor. All the patients with immune compromise have adrenal thyroid deficiency. They usually present with recurrent infections or severe acute infections like we're seeing now, prolonged infections, autoimmunity, and all of these conditions, and of course, cancer. I have not seen anybody with this list who does not have adrenal thyroid deficiency. And when we talk about deficiency, we're not necessarily referring to a deficiency which means that they're outside of the normal range, which is 10th to 90th percentile. We're talking about deficiency in the form of being on the lower end, below the 75th percentile. So what is the association of immunity and these hormones? So autoimmune conditions are associated with menopause. We know this. We know that every single immune cell has sex hormone receptors on it. Tons and tons of studies on that. And therefore, hormonal balance is key to immune function. Because for every stimulus, we're going to start to see hormonal balance. So when you think about for every stimulus, that means if you have your phone on and it rings, you're compromising your fuel tank for something that it might be more important. And the very first set of symptoms we see, especially in women, is low progesterone symptoms and also diseases related to that. Low progesterone symptoms because it's at the top of that chain. So a lot of times I can get by with just giving progesterone and it corrects the whole thing, especially if we use the rest of the 5-point model. So the progesterone symptoms that are at the top are going to be anxiety, insomnia, irritability, mood swings, PMS symptoms, heavy bleeding, the feeling of overwhelm, and of course, all the diseases like fibroids and breast cysts and hyperplasia and miscarriage, and also cancer, it turns out, especially. And it turns out that if your adrenals are low, it automatically means that thyroid function is low, because when the adrenals are compromised, you lower conversion to T3, you increase conversion to reverse T3, which blocks everything. You decrease receptor site function. And this is really an important point, because when you're measuring numbers and the numbers look like they're really even in the upper end of the 75th percentile, if the adrenals are still low, you don't have the receptor site function. It leads to disrupted lining of the intestines. Remember, we talked about the nervous system translating to that. And so you get leaky gut and overall decreased response. So anytime you treat adrenals, you have to treat the thyroid. And you will see the same functions, same kind of symptoms, which are things like low energy, low focus, memory, low mood, irregular periods, low metabolism, unexplained weight gain, sometimes cold hands, cold feet, dry hands, dry eyes, hair, skin, thin eyebrows, constipation, muscle pain. Remember that I was mentioning that anybody with these symptoms also has low immunity. So if you have a symptom, you always want to say, thank you for that symptom. Thank you for that symptom, because that's going to give you a chance to, you know, take a look at what's causing it. It's your body saying, hey, something's out of balance. Something's out of balance. And most of us are going to be feeling this low energy piece right now because of all the things that are happening. We're all getting depleted unless we learn how to do what I'm suggesting that you start with yourself today. Some of the conditions that you see from this low thyroid are chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, which doesn't exist, premature ovarian failure, depression, cancer, dementia, and congestive heart failure. And how does this relate to immunity? If you look, for example, at progesterone, and I want to show you just a little bit of data that I want to show you quickly, but it turns out that low progesterone over a long period of time from chronic stress increases all cancers by 10-fold and breast cancer by 5.4-fold. And this is a long-term study showing the association between chronic stress response, low progesterone, and cancer, because cancer is really addressed by progesterone. Progesterone's main function is to lower the proliferation of proliferating cells. That's why we give it when people are bleeding. So bioidentical progesterone is highly protective, whereas progestin, which is the one on the right that has all those little molecules that don't belong in the body, increases clots, strokes, and breast cancer by 5 to 8-fold. So this is what you are going to see in the literature. There's actually a recent study showing that progestins, which is the synthetic one, not bioidentical, reduces the antibody response to the flu. So it puts you at more risk. Whereas progesterone is a strong modulator of immune response in all of the cells you see, in macrophages, in NK cells. You remember I mentioned to you that all cells have receptors for these things. It turns out that progesterone itself is actually powerful against viruses, bacteria, and parasites, including HIV, simian virus, herpes, chlamydia, Gardnerella, Candida, And I can't tell you how many people, just by using natural progesterone, have a complete decrease in all of these. And you'll notice influenza A virus right at the bottom, because progesterone also has another mechanism, which it reduces the inflammatory response and it reduces NF-kappa beta. This is a fantastic article in Mucosal Immunology, if any of you want to read it. It has beautiful diagrams and it shows exactly how progesterone affects every part of this. And the reason why it's so important is because progesterone is the main hormone that we use to correct the adrenals, even in men. More recently, progesterone staves off the worst effects in influenza and infection, not only by speeding recovery, but the mechanism is by fixing damaged lung cells, which I find fascinating. Another study showing the exact same thing, that it repairs the lung and promotes faster recovery. So this is huge. So that takes us now to pregnenolone and DHEA. Pregnenolone and DHEA are all precursors of the cortisol pathway, and they are compromised when there's a chronic stress response. Pregnenolone is key to suppress inflammation, if you look at the studies. And it turns out that we know there is an age-related decline in DHEA, and this is in the Western world. This is not necessarily in the long-living cultures who maintain thyroid adrenal function till late in their years. But this age-related decline in immune function is associated with declining DHEA. And I can tell you, DHEA is one of the key ingredients that we use for anybody with immune failure and anybody with cancer. So this is something which is really, I tell you, take a look at your levels in the morning. You don't want to measure DHEA. What you want to measure is DHEAS, and I'll show you that in a second. But it turns out that DHEA can protect against lethal viral infections, and it reduces viral titers in lungs and promotes survival in H1N1 and H3N2. It has powerful immune-enhancing antiviral effects, including increasing monocytes, B cells, B cell activity, T cell activity, interleukins, natural killer cell number. Really, no wonder this is such a miracle for people with cancers and immune issues. And then, of course, there's testosterone, and there's plenty of studies also on testosterone. But the reason why I present it this way, you have progesterone, pregnenolone, DHEA, testosterone, cortisol, is because it's important to realize that's the whole pathway that's involved. And I want to give you an example of a patient. Her name is HC. And I want you to take a look at the red ones, because this will make the point. So when I find the deficiency in the adrenals, usually all three are off: pregnenolone, progesterone, DHEAS. We want all of those. For example, DHEAS should really be greater than 200 to 250 in a woman in the morning, but hers is 78. And 180 to 237 for pregnenolone in the morning, really greater than 200, and hers is 90, right about 50%. And of course, progesterone is 0. And this patient is in her 30s, and she actually came in with the prime complaint of infertility. She had been trying to get pregnant for 3 years, and she presented with the red ones: low progesterone symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, PMS, and infertility. So those are the progesterone symptoms she had. And then, of course, comes the thyroid. So I want to hold there, because I'm going to tell you about what I did with her once I covered the thyroid. It was the adrenal thyroid is always covered together in the program. But we know that as far as thyroid, alterations in thyroid hormone affect immune function. And if you look at this diagram, you can see how immune dysregulation, inflammation, leaky gut, they're all connected to each other and low thyroid hormones. And it turns out that T3 and T4 are vital for both innate and adaptive immunity. And again, another hormone which I use especially if I see adrenal dysfunction. It doesn't much matter whether or not we're on the low end or the high end. I'm assuming that your receptor sites are downregulated. And we have to remember that thyroid regulates temperature. And that temperature has an effect on immunity. It's the body's natural way to get rid of viruses. So, and infections. So when we run around, you know, immediately wanting to lower our temperature when we see a fever, I think we're interfering with the immune response. What do you think? So this is the patient I told you about with the thyroid being low, and this is the same patient with the infertility. And remember, she presented with lower energy and irregular periods also. So the free T3, I really like to see it above 4. Most ranges are up at 6.8. Hers is at 2.7. This will not work. I also want to point out the TSH. I really don't use the TSH. I want it under 1.8. I feel it's a rather useless number. The lowest part where you see vitamin D, I want that over 70, and she's at 33. And remember, thyroid is dependent on the right level of vitamin D. And reverse T3 is a blocking agent. So anytime you see stress, you're going to see downregulation of receptor sites and upregulation of reverse T3, which basically blocks the thyroid and creates all of these symptoms: low energy, low mental clarity, irregular periods, low mood, low metabolism, and all the things I talked about. In this patient's case, she actually presented with low energy, irregular periods, low mood, and infertility. So what we started her on was progesterone, 25 milligrams to 100 milligrams. And in a couple of weeks, after giving her enough magnesium to lower the response of the nervous system, we would give her thyroid. We also put her on an essential multivitamin and mineral, which had the doses we talked about, and 10,000 units of vitamin D. And all of these things I've talked to you about: breathing outdoors, simplifying life, and I will give you the result on this patient at the end of this talk, which will be soon. And then that brings me, so that was an example of adrenal thyroid problems. That brings me to melatonin. Melatonin is a major immune hormone, and the melatonin levels decline by over 60% by age 40. And the more light at night we're exposed to, the worse, because it turns out that the blue light at night, according to Harvard University, suppresses melatonin and circadian rhythm, disrupts REM sleep, induces mitochondrial damage. Really, do we really want to be on these crazy devices at night? I don't think so. And I don't think so because we're messing up the circadian method by which we are exposed to light. And a few years ago, these guys, physicians, actually won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for proving that any mismatch in the internal clock and the external environment can cause disease. And luckily, within 7 days of following the circadian rhythm, so if you want to reset the circadian rhythm of every single cell in your body, including your immune cells, they're all run by the level of natural light that enters and programs the suprachiasmatic nucleus and starts to program all the cells in your body. Just take yourself to a place, wake up with the sun, and sleep with the sun for 7 days, and you will restore the circadian rhythm of your body. But then we have to maintain it. It turns out that melatonin is a powerful antioxidant. It can prevent multi-organ failure and sepsis, and that is really important. It decreases viral load and activates body's natural hormone-like agents like gamma interferon. And it turns out that more recently, this was published, where it's being used as a potential adjuvant and suggested for SARS because it limits virus-related disease. And this other study actually came out just very recently, last month, And it's recommending that in high-risk individuals like elderly and people with medical comorbidities, we use 3 to 10 milligrams of melatonin. And for healthcare providers, we use 40 milligrams a day of melatonin. So this is the newer recommendations, and I agree with it. The science also shows and makes a very good point for using melatonin when you're on hydroxychloroquine. And they give different kinds of doses, but really up to 200 milligrams twice a day. And believe me, people will tolerate that if they're in the intensive care unit, but it completely lowers the side effects. So there's many studies showing that it's critical to immune function. So I would suggest that you become familiar with using this one. So that brings us to the end of the 5-point model, where underlying imbalances in 5 areas leads to all symptoms and disease, including immune weakness. And if we want to be like the long living, we get in the sun, reconnect ourselves to nature. That is the answer, and make sure that we're in a vibration of joy. Now, how do we track these 5 areas? That's important. And right after that, I'm going to show you the end of that case and make some recommendations for you. So as far as tracking these 5 areas, I mentioned several times that you always aim for optimal levels or upper quartile. And this really is starkly evident when we see how we manage thyroid. How many people come to you, or how many of you have thyroid symptoms, lower energy, lower mental clarity, lower mood, lower metabolism, and your labs are in the normal range and not in the upper 75th percentile? But this same issue occurs with vitamin D. We know that vitamin D levels in the upper quartile protect from cancers and strokes and heart attacks by over 50%. We follow the same idea in bone density. We look for bone density and start jumping up and down when it's minus 2.5 standard deviations from the norm. Why would we accept that? We should be hopping up and down with bone density drops from +2 to +1, because that's ideal. It's the same with cortisol, same with blood pressure. Over 20 years now of cardiovascular research is showing that by the time that diastolic pressure creeps above 90, we already have stiffening of the vessels. And we should have been responding when the blood pressure went diastolic from 60 to 70. We should have been asking why. Why are the vessels getting stiff? Why is the nitric oxide reduced and the pliability reducing? So that similar example goes for all. Fasting blood sugar under 85 drops your sudden cardiac death risk. So we're not looking for normal levels. Let's just say that. And in fact, there's plenty of studies. I'm not going to go through it. I showed you a little bit about vitamin D, but there's very good studies for the hormones also. And here's an example that the serum progesterone in the highest quartile drops the breast cancer incidence about 40 to 60%. And as I mentioned, the vitamin D in the upper quartile does the same. But when I mentioned to you, how do we track these? And I'm showing you some measurements to keep in the optimal range. I'm going to tell you that first and foremost, pay attention to the clinical parameters of regeneration. If these 6 things are handled, then everything else corrects itself. 8 hours of continuous sleep, not waking up. Because when you wake up, you're not repairing your DNA. You're not repairing your immune system. You're not repairing the adrenal glands. You need 8 continuous hours and 5 continuous sleep cycles shown by NIH sleep studies over 20 years. You want no anxiety, no pain, and no gastric symptoms. Gastric symptoms are a sign that something's wrong. All gastric symptoms eventually lead to some kind of disease. You want to be in a great mood, and you want to have great energy in the morning and the evening. And this doesn't just apply for when you're less than age 30. So this slide was actually out of order, but this patient, HC, at the start, actually presented with very little sleep, 7 panic attacks, anxiety level of 7, and 2 to 3 panic attacks per week, almost 7 per month. Her energy was 2 to 7. She had a low mood because of anxiety. And luckily, she didn't have any pain or gastric symptoms. But remember, I mentioned to you that this patient had thyroid adrenal compromise. And that's why she had these symptoms, including the infertility and all the symptoms of low thyroid. And one of the things to realize is that when you start to correct these things, the periods come back, the premature ovarian failure goes away. Premature ovarian failure is being diagnosed at a very large rate right now, and it's because of the imbalances. Once you correct them, I can't tell you how many of these patients have gone on to get pregnant and have 1, 2, 3, 4 children. So always know the adrenal thyroid function symptoms, and this will all be available for you to see. But I also wanted to show you how we measure. So I already measured and mentioned that you're looking for the hormones and nutrition to be above the 75th percentile. You're looking for the pH to be above 6.7. You're looking for a coherent heart rate variability. And there's a measurement called phase angle I haven't mentioned, but that's something which you want to have in the right place. If you were the long living, you'd be on your program as long as you connected to the sun, the earth, the water, the oxygen, and the joy, and balanced your life. Why? Because if you look at these people who live in these long living cultures, and this is a book by Dr. John Apsley that really talks about how the 5-point model protocols approximate regeneration nature's way, like the blue zones. The average American typically starts aging at 35 and is facing chronic illness by their late 50s or 60s. But in the long living cultures, this doesn't happen until you're 80 years old. So they end up providing us a great mechanism of looking at and a great model to understand why they are able to live long, active lives, climbing mountains, climbing steps. This guy's a really interesting case. He lived here in Florida. He developed cancer. He was age 60. He went back to his Icaria, his place of birth, and decided that he was going to die there. But what happened as he started getting in the sun and dancing with the joy, he lived to 102. And these people do this on less than $1,000 of income per year because they're connected. They're connected to each other. They're connected to the joy field that connects us all and creates a field of joy. And they don't deplete their hormones. Do you think that the long living use hormone therapy? Absolutely not. They're connected to the earth. And so they're protected by taking advantage of nature's gifts, if you will. So that brings me to the summary. Hormone balance is key to immune function. Autoimmune conditions are associated with menopause. I showed you multiple studies showing that, and also that sex hormone receptors are on all the immune cells. The hormonal imbalance starts with the chronic stress response. And as I was mentioning in this patient, these are the symptoms you see in people with a chronic stress response. This is what you see. This is a typical example of what you see. And this is what you see, which is when the adrenals are low, the thyroid is low, and you get all the other thyroid symptoms. All the steroid hormones are compromised in a chronic stress response. And the result on this patient at 10 months, she was pregnant with her first child. And after her birth, she's trying to get pregnant again. I actually think she is pregnant again. And if you look at what her program involved, it was exactly what we talked about. We asked her to balance her life. And that's the conscious part. And then to start to correct the emotions around things that are stressors. We provided her with progesterone at 125 milligrams is where she ended up. We started her at 25 and she kept going up until anxiety and sleep were fully corrected. And because we had her on the magnesium ATA, she ended up on 3 or 4 capsules of that. Her anxiety was down, her nervous system was down, she wasn't overwhelmed, and then we were able to add the thyroid. And the essential multivitamin mineral doses that are needed to activate all of these hormones. And of course, we gave her 10,000 units of vitamin D. So the key points in her was that the chronic stress response always corresponds with PMS, infertility, and premature ovarian failure because it leads to a low fuel tank. You always have to start with balancing life. Adrenal low means thyroid low, and we always start with attending to anxiety and sleep, and the rest correct. I can't say enough about neurological magnesium. And you know that if somebody's presenting with these things, they're also presenting with low immunity. I use adrenal herbs in these patients. They're very useful. But I feel like there's something that you use for 6 to 12 months. In this time that we're in right now, I'm recommending that people use adrenal herbs because it's one way for us to be resilient in the face of what's happening. We, of course, corrected her chronic stress response because it equals low immunity. And I've mentioned to you that all patients with immune compromise have adrenal thyroid deficiency. There's no one who has an immune compromise who doesn't have adrenal thyroid deficiency. So these are these patients who are coming in with recurrent infections, severe acute infections, including COVID, prolonged infections, autoimmunity, and cancer. So if you see those patients, they have adrenal thyroid deficiency, and you correct it with the 5-point model because we are living in modern times. And the stressors we're having are things like moves and separations and financial. And all of you know, this, I can guarantee you, is the profile that's coming in for most of our healthcare providers. And when I started to see healthcare providers in 2006, I never recognized this much adrenal insufficiency. But what has happened over this past 10 to 15 years is I've noticed that almost 90% of all healthcare providers have these deficiencies. So you definitely want to start with the simple things and then measure. Because modern civilization, I claim, is man's greatest disease. So the key points to balance your hormones in modern society is to measure your hormone labs before 8 a.m. and correct to the 75th percentile. Correct the adrenal first until sleep is 8 solid hours and anxiety is low. And you do this with magnesium and oral progesterone. And oral progesterone is the only thing that works well for the adrenals. And you titrate in 25 milligram increments, that's slow release, to a max of 350 milligrams. Now this is a lot to cover. This is something I'll be covering in great detail with cases and protocols in the October symposium, which will be virtual. Your next is correct thyroid. And actually in that symposium, we're going to be doing many cases and many protocols. You'll be going home with protocols. And you want to correct this until energy, focus, mood, and metabolism are perfect. And always start with yourself. Use the DHEA 25 to 50 or pregnenolone 50 to 100 as indicated by labs, and use adrenal herbals if somebody's willing to take another pill. Because remember, what you're trying to do is have the least number of pills. So my prescription for you: slow the speed of your engine to preserve your reserve, reduce conscious stressors by simplifying life, observe the speed of your thoughts, your words, and your actions, because we run fast. And when we start to observe, we also start to observe what's not necessary and what things we can eliminate, you know. Get in a tub. My goodness, get some magnesium, Epsom salt, get some flowers, love yourself. Put some candles on. If there's, these are the things, these balance your immune system. These balance your hormonal system. It's all the same thing. Learn the heart math. It turns out that heartmath.org actually has something called a heart math experience to teach you how to get from the top to the bottom. And there's an app. Breathe. Prepare this water every morning, and make sure that any supplement you take is pure and doesn't have magnesium stearate, especially or vegetable stearate. Lots of clever people have started labeling this as vegetable stearate, and make sure you have the minimum doses that are needed for hormone activation of chromium, zinc, selenium, iodine, B12, and all active forms of B. And you always want to be in a delayed release form, because that's going to allow you to absorb those B vitamins without a problem. For hormone optimization, use the acetyltaurinate magnesium. I'm going to tell you that I think everybody, all of you need it. So there's nothing to think about there. The healing powers of your energy are both magical and miraculous. Say that over and over, because you need to be in the driver's seat for your health. And I hope that this has given you some hope. And my suggestion for today, to start your prescription, is get outdoors, ground yourself in the soil, breathe, get your adrenal aid, just get some water with some lemon and salt in it, and take some deep belly breaths. The more you connect to nature, the more you will regenerate like the people in the blue zones. I want to mention all the exciting things that we have to offer. We are offering consults that are one-on-one at Sejun for anybody who's interested. I really recommend that you attend the October 2020 virtual conference, Optimizing Immunity for Cancer and Infection Protocols and Cases, because that is where we're going to go through case after case after case, and protocols and protocols and protocols. There's 2 webinars that are already up on icrmlearn.org that I think are relevant. It's the new data on COVID and the exact protocol to handle it, and also the electromagnetic field corrections. And of course, this hormone one will be up, and the nutrition one next. We're doing one for each part of the 5-point model. So the DVD with basic and advanced hormonal cases are also available. And